ancient Greece's most ridiculous jobs that no longer exist. In the flickering light of an olive oil lamp, a man in Athens once spent his entire night collecting stray dogs' urine from public streets. At dawn, he sold it to a fuller who used it to whiten tunics. Another man, in Sparta, had the sole responsibility of shouting insults at young warriors during dinner. A third, in Corinth, followed elephants with a bronze shovel, waiting for them to defecate. These were not jokes. These were jobs. Before we laugh, let us understand, ancient Greece had no word for ridiculous occupation. It had bonorzos, a term for low, manual, often shameful work done by those without citizen rights. But some tasks went beyond low. They entered the realm of the bizarre, the specialized, the inexplicably necessary. This is the story of those jobs. We will travel through the Greek world from 800 BCE to 146 BCE, from the Agora of Athens to the docks of Delos, from Spartan barracks to Egyptian Greek colonies. We will meet the sycophant before it meant flatterer, it meant professional accuser, the logographer speechwriter for the illiterate, the trapezomisthos table-salaried servant who wiped diners' hands with bread. Each job existed because of a specific, forgotten need. No washing machines, no police, no paper, no plumbing, no advertising, no labor-saving devices. What we call ridiculous, they called survival. But survival took strange forms. Consider the parasitos, originally a priest's assistant who ate sacred grains, later a professional dinner guest who endured mockery for a free meal. Or the kissokosmos, a slave who arranged ivy around a symposium host's head, adjusting leaves to hide bald spots. Or the Ani Kasmaris, a manicurist who also perfumed fingernails, but only for the right hand. Left hands were considered unclean for perfume. We will organize these jobs into 7 absurd categories: sanitation, politics, military, feasting, commerce, religion, and death. Each category reveals a hidden corner of Greek life. And each job, no matter how strange, once breathed real sweat, real shame, real coins. Let us begin with the filthiest. The excremental economy. The coprologos dung collector. The coprologos woke before dawn. Not from virtue, from competition. He carried a wicker basket, a wooden scraper, and a ceramic jug for liquid waste. His territory, the alleys behind Athens' Kerameikos district, where potters worked and donkeys rested. His prize, horse dung, dog dung, human dung, anything dried enough to lift. Why did anyone pay for feces? Fuel. In deforested Attica, dried dung burned slowly, produced little smoke, and was free if you collected it. The city's bathhouses bought coprologos harvest by the basket. Poor families stacked dung patties against their walls like grotesque bricks. The job required no skill but one, distinguishing fresh from dry. Fresh dung could not be sold too wet, too smelly, too heavy. The coprologos learned to tap a pile with his stick. If it crumbled, gold. If it squelched, walk away. But competition was fierce. Each neighborhood had its own collector, marked by a red clay token hung around the neck. Disputes over dung piles sometimes ended in fisticuffs. An inscription from the Piraeus records a case. Leander the coprologos accuses Simon of stealing 6 basketfuls from the sacred gate latrine. The magistrate ruled in Leander's favor, not for justice, but because Simon had been caught mixing goat droppings into horse dung. Goat burned faster, cheating the bathhouse. The most prestigious dung was human, specifically from the Academy Gymnasium, where philosophers exercised. Stoics produced particularly prized fuel. According to a comic fragment, Zeno's leavings burn twice as long. All that logic hardens the bowel. Whether true or joke, the coprologos of the Academy charged triple. Women could not be coprologa, too shameful. But elderly male slaves often ended up in this trade as punishment. One master in Olynthus threatened his runaway cook, If I catch you, you will collect from the oxen until your beard turns white. The threat worked. The cook returned. The job vanished not because of toilets. Greeks had latrines but no sewage systems outside a few palaces, but because of charcoal. When Macedonia opened new forests, charcoal became cheap. By 300 BCE, the coprologos had nearly disappeared, replaced by the charcoal burner. But for 2 centuries, Athens ran on dried shit. The Uranian siphon, urine siphon. More specialized than the coprologos was the Uranian siphon, literally sky siphon, a euphemism for one who collected urine from public urinals. He carried a hollow reed tube and a goatskin bladder. His method: insert reed into fresh urine, suck the other end carefully, using a cloth filter, and let gravity fill the bladder. A full bladder earned 2 obols from the fuller's workshop. Fuller's laundrymen used urine as a detergent. The ammonia broke down grease and whitened wool. But fresh urine worked best, especially from prepubescent boys. High ammonia or from men who had eaten asparagus believed to strengthen the cleaning power. The Uranian siphon learned to identify quality urine by color, smell, and even taste. A single drop on the tongue, professional hazard. The job carried a unique social depth. In Aristophanes the Frogs, a character threatens, "I'll make you a urine sipper." It was the worst insult imaginable. Yet the siphon earned more than a rower in the Navy, 6 obols per day plus tips from fullers who wanted first pick. One inscription praises a siphon named Dromius. He never diluted the bladder with water. He was honest. Honesty in urine collection meant not cheating the fuller. Women occasionally worked as siphons in Thebes, where a law forbade men from entering women's public latrines. A female siphon named Timorete is mentioned in a fragment. She could tell a drunk's urine from a sober's by the sediment alone. Drunk urine was rejected, too weak in ammonia. The job ended when Roman fullers introduced fuller's earth clay as a cleaning agent. By 150 BCE, the Uranian siphon existed only in jokes. But for a while, urine was liquid gold. The Catapigasine Episcopos latrine inspector. Not all excremental jobs involved handling waste. The Catapigasine Episcopos inspected latrines, specifically, the public latrines of Athens Agora. His tools: a long stick, a candle, a wax tablet for notes. His duty: ensure that no one had blocked the wooden seats, that the drainage channel, a stone gutter running below, flowed freely, and that no citizen had been pushed into the pit. A common assault. Why a dedicated inspector? Because Athens had 180 public latrines by 400 BCE, each seating 10 to 30 people side by side. Sponges on sticks, the original toilet paper, were shared, rinsed in a vinegar bucket between uses. The inspector checked the sponges for dangerous fraying. A frayed sponge could lodge inside a user. He also ensured the vinegar bucket was refilled daily. The most important duty: preventing the theft of latrine seats. Wooden seats with carved holes were valuable. One night in 415 BCE, someone stole all 30 seats from the Piraeus latrine. Citizens had to squat over open pits for a week. The inspector lost his job. Inspectors were elected annually, usually by men too old or unpopular for real office. It was a punishment posting. One inspector, Theophrastos, wrote a bitter complaint: "They call me Lord of the Sponge, but I have not eaten meat in 3 months." Still, the job came with a perk. Inspectors could fine anyone caught defecating outside a latrine. The fine was 5 drachmas, half going to the inspector. Theophrastos once caught a wealthy perfume seller using an alley. He chased the man 3 blocks, holding his candle high, shouting 5 drachmas. The man paid. The position disappeared under Macedonian rule. When latrine maintenance became a military duty, soldiers hate cleaning latrines even more than civilians. But for a golden century, Athens had a man whose full-time job was watching people poop. The prosopon Myocalex fly face catcher. We move from solid waste to winged pests. The Prosopon myocalex, literally face flycatcher, worked exclusively in rich households during summer. His job: stand behind the master's dining couch with a feathery branch, usually oleander, and shoo flies away from the master's face, food, and wine. But not just shoo, he had to catch them. Because flies landing on food were bad luck, but flies caught and killed during dinner were an omen of short life for the household. So the Prosopon myocalex developed techniques. Some used sticky twigs coated in honey. Others used quick-clapping wooden paddles. A famous flycatcher named Pamphilos could snatch a fly from midair using only his thumb and forefinger. He demonstrated this at banquets for extra tips. The job required absolute silence. The catcher could not cough, sneeze, or breathe audibly. He stood for 4 to 6 hours, motionless except for arm movements. Many developed spinal problems. One catcher in Syracuse fell asleep standing up and toppled into the fish course. He was not fired, he was drowned in the harbor. Rich Syracusans had little mercy. Fly-catching was considered women's work in Sparta. Spartan men refused to do anything that didn't involve fighting. But in Athens, it was a boy's job, young male slaves aged 8 to 12. A good flycatcher could be sold for 3 times the price of a regular house slave. A fragment of a sales contract reads, "One boy, age 10, proven flycatcher, 37 kills in one symposium, no guarantee against future laziness." The job became obsolete when Greeks introduced mosquito nets imported from Egypt and flypaper papyrus soaked in myrrh. By 250 BCE, the Prosopon myocalex survived only in the most traditional households, like a butler who refuses to use a vacuum. The Scor amphoreus dung amphora carrier. A final excremental note: the Scor amphoreus carried human waste from wealthy houses to farms in clay amphorae. Unlike the coprologos who collected dry dung for fuel, this worker collected fresh, wet waste for fertilizer. Rich Athenians had private latrines that emptied into a pit. Once a month, the Scor amphoreus arrived with 10 amphorae, a wooden lid, and a cloth soaked in vinegar tied over his nose and mouth. He descended into the pit, usually 5 feet deep, scooped the waste into amphorae, sealed them with clay, and loaded them onto a donkey cart. Then he walked 3 miles to the nearest farm, where the farmer paid 2 obols per amphora. The farmer then aged the waste in a separate pit for 6 months before spreading it on crops. Fresh waste burned plant roots. This job was deadly. The pit contained methane and hydrogen sulfide. Many Scor amphoreus died from asphyxiation. Others developed chronic respiratory diseases. A gravestone from Boeotia reads, "Here lies Nicias, who carried what others left behind. He died as he lived, with his mouth full of vinegar cloth." Despite the danger, the job paid well, 12 obols per day, more than a skilled sculptor. And it offered a strange dignity. Farmers called the Scor amphoreus the bringer of growth. In some villages, he was invited to harvest festivals, though he ate apart from others. The job disappeared with the invention of the cesspit emptying chain, a bucket on a rope, operated from above. But for centuries, Greek farmers relied on men willing to wade through shit for bread. The political absurdities. The sycophant professional accuser. Today, sycophant means flatterer. In ancient Athens, it meant something far worse. A professional accuser who made a living by prosecuting wealthy citizens for crimes against the state. The word comes from Sycon fig and Phanian to show, originally, someone who informed on fig smugglers. Fig exports were state-controlled, smuggling figs was treason. But by 450 BC, the sycophant accused anyone of anything, as long as a fine might follow. Here is how it worked. Athens had no public prosecutor. Crimes had to be prosecuted by private citizens. If you won your case, the convicted criminal paid a fine, and you, the prosecutor, received a portion, usually 1/3. The sycophant made this a business. He would watch rich men carefully, looking for technical violations, a badly placed boundary stone, a witness who had not shown up to a previous trial, a tax paid 1 day late. Then he would sue. The most famous sycophant was a man named Aristogiton, not the tyrannicide. He prosecuted over 200 cases in 20 years. He once sued a merchant for having a rusted anchor violation of naval readiness law. He sued a baker for making loaves too small. The standard loaf size was fixed by law. He sued a widow for owning a rooster that crowed before dawn noise ordinance. He won most cases because defendants preferred to settle out of court, paying the sycophant to drop the suit. The job was despised but legal. Demosthenes, the great orator, wrote an entire speech titled Against the Sycophants, but he could not eliminate them. The only check: if a sycophant lost a case and failed to get at least 1/5 of the jury's votes, he paid a heavy fine. So sycophants only sued open and shut cases, or cases where the defendant was too scared to fight. Sycophants often worked in teams. One would observe, another would file paperwork, a third would intimidate witnesses. They were known to carry small knives, not for violence, but for cutting boundary markers to create fake property disputes. The job ended with Macedonian occupation. The new rulers did not allow private prosecutions, they preferred royal courts. Sycophants became flatterers, hence the modern meaning. But for 2 centuries, Athens had a class of men who made money by being hated. The graph paranomen reader, unlawful decree reader. Every Athenian law had a strange feature: any citizen could challenge a new law as unconstitutional. The challenge was called a graph paranomen. But someone had to read the challenged law aloud to the jury, and that someone had to do it without emotion, without emphasis, without any hint of persuasion. Enter the graph paranomen reader. This was a low-level clerk, paid by the state, who did nothing but read laws. He sat in the courtroom with a papyrus scroll. When a law was challenged, he unrolled it and read it exactly as written, including punctuation marks Greeks used to show pauses and marginal notes. He could not look at the jury. He could not raise or lower his voice. He had to read at a steady pace, 1 word per second. Why such precision? Because Athenian juries, 501 men, chosen by lot, were famously emotional. A law read with indignation could sway them. A law read with sympathy could sway them differently. So the state employed neutral readers, usually metics, resident foreigners who had no political rights and thus no stake in the outcome. The reader earned 3 obols per day, the same as a rower. But the job required perfect eyesight and literacy, rare in ancient Greece. Most readers were retired school teachers or failed philosophers. One reader, a Stoic named Clentes, became famous for reading a law about olive tree protection with such flat effect that the jury fell asleep. When they woke, they had forgotten the case and dismissed it. Clentes was praised for his beautiful emptiness. The position was abolished under the democracy's reform of 322 BCE, when juries were reduced to 201 men and readers were replaced by the magistrate himself. But for a century, the most boring job in Athens was also one of the most important. The ostracan counter. Shirt counter. Ostracism, the practice of voting to exile a citizen for 10 years, required counting thousands of pottery shards ostraka. Each shard had a name scratched into it. After the vote, officials gathered all shards into the agora. Then came the ostracan counter. His job: sort shards by name, count each pile, and report the total. Sounds simple, but consider, an ostracism vote might involve 8,000 shards. Many were illegible, bad handwriting, broken edges. Some had multiple names, voters who changed their minds. A few were fakes. Enemies of a candidate would write their opponent's name on hundreds of shards ahead of time and bribe voters to use them. The counter had to verify each shard. He held it up to light. He checked the clay type. Only shards from official agora pottery were accepted. Someone once tried to use a roof tile. He compared handwriting when suspicious. And he did this for 12 hours straight, sitting on a stone bench, while the crowd shouted for results. The job required absolute honesty. In 482 BCE, a counter named Hipparchus was caught adding fake shards against Themistocles. He was executed. After that, counters worked in pairs, each counting independently, then comparing totals. If they disagreed, a third counter was called. If the third agreed with one, the other was fined. Counters were chosen from the tribe of the Archon, but no one wanted the job. It was tedious, painful clay dust-irritated eyes, and low-paid 2 obols per day. In a comic fragment, a character says, "I'd rather be a sycophant than an ostracan counter. At least sycophants get to stand up." Ostracism itself ended around 417 BC. The last victim was Hyperbolos, a demagogue. The ostracan counter vanished with it. But archaeologists have found thousands of shards, each one a testament to a man who spent his day counting names on broken pots. The Prytany Sandwich Carrier. The Prytany Executive Committee of the Athenian Council met every day in the Tholos, a round building near the Agora. They ate lunch there, state-funded barley bread, olives, cheese, and diluted wine. But someone had to bring the food from the Agora market, which was 50 yards away. That someone was the Prytany Sandwich Carrier. This job sounds trivial, but it had strict rules. The carrier, always a public slave, had to carry the food on a wooden tray, covered with a linen cloth, and walk at a slow, deliberate pace. He could not run. Running implied the food was stolen. He could not talk to anyone. Talking implied he might poison the food. He had to wear a white tunic, changed daily, to show cleanliness. The carrier also tasted the food before serving. Each morning, he ate a small piece of bread, a single olive, and a sip of wine in front of the Prytany president. If he did not fall ill after an hour, the Prytany ate. This was the official poison test. The carrier thus risked his life daily, though no Prytany was ever poisoned in Athenian history. The job had one perk: leftover food. After the Prytany finished, the carrier could eat whatever remained. Since Prytanys often had poor appetites, political stress, the carrier ate well. One carrier, a Thracian slave named Zalmoxis, grew so fat on leftovers that he could no longer fit through the Tholos door. He was replaced. The position was abolished by the 30 tyrants in 404 BCE, then restored under the democracy, then finally ended by the Macedonians. But for 100 years, a slave's full-time job was to walk 50 yards with a tray. The Kerix Epitaphios funeral herald crier. After the state funeral for fallen soldiers, a herald had to shout the names of the dead across the Kerameikos cemetery. This was not a simple announcement. The herald stood on a raised platform and shouted each name 3 times, once toward the city, once toward the sea, once toward the cemetery. Between names, he paused for 30 seconds of silence. The job required enormous lung capacity. Some names were long. Aristogiton Philocleus Lamptrius Aristogiton, son of Philocles, from Lamptrae. The herald had to shout without breaking the name into syllables. He also had to remember the order. Names were not written down during the ceremony. Writing was considered unlucky for the dead. Heralds trained for years. They practiced shouting across valleys, against wind, while holding a stone in each hand to strengthen diaphragm. A famous herald, Euphemos of Kolonos, could shout for 4 hours without water. He performed at the funeral of Pericles 429 BCE and reportedly made the stone lions weep, or so the story goes. The job was hereditary. Only families with herald ancestors could serve. If a herald family died out, Athens went without state funerals until a new family was appointed. This happened in 378 BCE. No funerals were held for 3 years. The Epitaphios herald disappeared with the rise of written epitaphs. By 250 BCE, names were carved on stone, and shouting became obsolete. But for a century, Athens' loudest men had the saddest job. The military foolishness. The Aspidiskophoros shield polisher's assistant. Every hoplite heavy infantryman owned a bronze shield aspis. Bronze tarnished quickly in sea air. Polishing was constant work. But the polisher could not do it alone. The shield weighed 20 pounds and was concave, making the inner surface hard to reach. So the aspidiscophoros held the shield steady while the polisher worked. His job: sit on a three-legged stool, hold the shield against his chest with both hands, and rotate it slowly as the polisher applied pumice and vinegar. He had to keep the shield perfectly still. Any wobble caused uneven polish. He also had to avoid breathing on the bronze. Breath moisture caused new tarnish. The job was given to the youngest and weakest soldiers, boys aged 15 to 17, or men too injured for combat. In Spartan training, the aspidiscophoros was considered a punishment role. Boys who failed weapons drill spent a week holding shields. Their arms ached for days afterward. But the job had an unexpected benefit: intimate knowledge of shield construction. Many aspidiscophoroi became armorers later in life. The most famous was a Spartan named Brasidas, who held shields as a teenager, then invented a new shield design that saved Spartan lives at the Battle of Sphacteria 425 BCE. He later became a general. The position lasted as long as bronze shields lasted, until the 200s BCE, when iron shields became common. Iron tarnishes but can be left with a dark patina. The last aspidiscophoros recorded is a Macedonian slave named Alexon, who died in 210 BC holding a shield that no one bothered to polish. The toxotes skiagraphos arrow shadow drawer. Archers in Greek armies carried arrows in a quiver. But at night, they could not see their arrows. Solution: the toxotes skiagraphos, a second archer who stood behind the first with a torch, casting a shadow of the arrow onto the target. The first archer aimed at the shadow. This absurd job emerged during the Peloponnesian War 431 to 404 BCE, when Athens fought night battles in Sicily. Archers needed to fire into dark camps. A bright torch behind the archer created a clear arrow shadow, but only if the shadow drawer held the torch at exactly the right height and angle. Too high, the shadow stretched. Too low, the shadow disappeared. Too close, the archer was blinded. Too far, the shadow was faint. The shadow drawer trained for months. He learned to judge distance by sound, to keep the torch steady in wind, and to move silently. Torchlight attracted enemy arrows. The job was extremely dangerous. Shadow drawers were the first target in any night engagement. Enemies aimed for the light. Mortality rates exceeded 70%. Despite the danger, volunteers came forward because the pay was double that of a normal archer. And the job required no archery skill, only steady hands and courage. A shadow drawer named Thrasillos survived 3 campaigns, then retired to Athens and opened a bakery. His sign showed a torch and an arrow, with the words, "I held the light so others could kill." The job became obsolete with the invention of the flaming arrow, which illuminated its own path. But for 20 years, Greek archers fired at shadows held by men who could not shoot back. The hippozandales horse sandal strapper. Greek cavalry horses wore bronze sandals, the ancestor of the horseshoe, but strapped on, not nailed. Each sandal had 4 leather straps. Before battle, someone had to strap all 4 sandals onto each horse, tight enough to stay on during a charge, loose enough not to cut off circulation. That someone was the hippozandales. He worked in pairs. One man held the horse's leg. Horses dislike having their feet touched, the other strapped. A cavalry unit of 100 horses required 400 sandals, 1,600 straps, and 200 strap checks. Each strap had to be checked twice, before mounting and before the charge. The hippozandales had no assistant. He did all the strapping himself, moving from horse to horse. The job required extraordinary physical strength. Horses weigh 1,000 pounds and kick hard. Many hipposandaloi lost teeth. Others lost fingers. A gravestone from Thessaly shows a man with only 3 fingers on his left hand, holding a strap. The inscription, He strapped until he could not. But the job had prestige. A good hipposandales could keep sandals on through a full battle. A bad one would lose sandals in the first charge, leaving horses barefoot and unable to gallop on rocky ground. Cavalry commanders paid well for skilled strappers. The best could earn as much as a junior officer. The job ended when nailed horseshoes arrived from Gaul around 200 BCE. Strapped sandals disappeared within a generation. But for 3 centuries, Greek horses could not charge without a man who knew how to tie a knot under a kicking hoof. The Socrates tent folder. Greek armies used leather tents that folded into a specific shape, a rectangle, then a triangle, then a cylinder, then a flat disc. Folding required 4 hands and a wooden template. The Socrates tent folder held the template while soldiers folded around it. Without the template, the tent would not fit into its carrying bag. This job seemed simple, but the template was heavy bronze, 5 pounds. The folder had to hold it perfectly still while 3 soldiers pulled leather around it. Any shift in the template, even a finger's width, ruined the fold. Then the tent had to be unfolded and restarted. During Alexander's campaign in Asia 334 to 323 BCE, tent folders marched with the baggage train. They were considered non-combatants, but they often came under attack. One folder, a Macedonian named Leonatos, was captured by Persians while holding a template. The Persians thought the template was a weapon. It looked like a bronze shield. They executed him. Alexander later erected a monument to Leonatos, who died holding a folding form. After Alexander, armies used smaller tents that rolled instead of folding. The Socrates disappeared. But for a generation, the most important man in camp was the one who knew how to hold a piece of metal steady. The phalanx foot spacer. In the Macedonian phalanx, soldiers stood close enough to touch elbows. But too close, and they could not use their sarissas 18-foot pikes too far, and the formation had gaps. The solution, the phalanx foot spacer, a soldier whose only job was to walk behind the front line and tap the back of each man's foot with a stick, ensuring his feet were exactly shoulder-width apart. This job emerged from Philip II's military reforms 359 to 336 BCE. The phalanx required precise spacing. But in battle, with dust, noise, and fear, soldiers naturally bunched together. The foot spacer walked down the line, stick in hand, tapping any foot that moved too close to its neighbor. A single tap meant widen. 2 taps meant narrow. 3 taps meant stop moving entirely, you are perfect. The spacer carried no weapon, only the stick. He wore a distinctive helmet, a Boeotian style with a wide brim so soldiers could see him coming. He also shouted a rhythm, left, right, shoulder, 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 breathe, breathe, breathe. This was not a command, it was a calming mantra. Panicked soldiers forgot to breathe, spacers reminded them. The job was given to veteran soldiers who had lost the ability to fight, old men with bad knees, injured men with missing hands. But they had to be tall to see over helmets and loud to be heard over battle noise. One spacer, a 60-year-old named Hegesander, served at the Battle of Chaeronea 338 BCE. He kept the phalanx spaced so perfectly that the band's sacred band was crushed. After the battle, Philip gave Hegesander a silver cup. The foot spacer became obsolete when the phalanx was replaced by the legion. Roman armies used different spacing methods. But for 50 years, the most critical man in the most powerful army in Greece carried a stick and tapped feet. The feasting grotesqueries. The trapezomisthos table salaried bread wiper. At a Greek symposium drinking party, diners ate with their hands. No forks, no knives except for cutting, no napkins. They wiped their hands on pieces of bread, then threw the bread to the dogs. But in wealthy households, they employed the trapezomisthos, a slave whose job was to wipe diners' hands with bread and then eat the bread himself. Yes, you read that correctly. The trapezomisthos, literally table-salaried, stood behind each diner with a basket of bread pieces. When a diner raised a greasy hand, the trapezomisthos placed a bread piece in the palm, wiped gently, then popped the bread into his own mouth. He ate the grease, the sauce, the residue of the meal. This job was considered the lowest of the low, lower than dung collecting. Because the trapezomisthos did not just touch waste, he consumed waste. Yet the job paid surprisingly well, 5 obols per day plus meals, the same meals he wiped. Some slaves volunteered for the position because it offered better food than the slave quarters. A trapezomisthos ate meat, fish, cheese, olive paste, all the flavors of the symposium, mixed together in a greasy bread ball. The job required skill. The trapezomisthos had to wipe without touching the diner's skin, disgusting to the diner, and without dropping crumbs, disrespectful. He had to eat silently, without chewing noise. And he had to smile while eating, showing enjoyment of the food reassured the diner that the bread was fresh. A famous trapezomisthos named Dama served at the court of Dionysius of Syracuse. He could identify the diner by the taste of the bread alone. "This is Plato, I taste hemlock paranoia." When Dionysius asked Dama his opinion of a new chef, Dama replied, "I have eaten the evidence, my lord. Fire him." The chef was fired. The job ended with the introduction of napkins, linen cloths from Egypt around 300 BCE. But for 2 centuries, the highest status slaves in Greek kitchens were the ones who ate from the hands of the rich. The Kissakosmos IV arranger. Every symposium had a host who reclined on a couch, wearing a wreath of ivy or laurel on his head. The ivy was sacred to Dionysus. But ivy wilts quickly, and a wilted wreath brought bad luck. So the Kissakosmos IV arranger stood behind the host's couch, holding a basket of fresh ivy leaves. Every 15 minutes, he replaced any wilted leaves in the wreath. That is the official job. The unofficial job, hiding bald spots. Many Greek men, especially philosophers, went bald early. A wreath of ivy showed every gap in hair. The Kissakosmos learned to arrange leaves to cover baldness, layering larger leaves over the crown, using small leaves to create a fake hairline. This was considered an art. A good Kissakosmos could make a bald man look like Apollo. The Kissakosmos also checked for lice. Lice infested ivy wreaths. Ivy grew near the ground, where hares nested. Before placing any leaf, the Kissakosmos held it to a candle flame. Lice jumped away from heat. If no lice jumped, the leaf was safe. If lice jumped, the leaf was discarded, and the Kissakosmos had to recheck the host's hair for infestation. This job was usually performed by young female slaves, because women had smaller fingers and could arrange delicate leaves. A Kissakosmos named Myrrhine became famous in Athens for her baldness illusions. She charged extra for philosophers they were bald and cheap. When Socrates asked for a discount, she replied, "You have no hair and no money. I will give you a single leaf. Wear it as a hat." Socrates laughed. The story appears in Xenophon's Symposium. The Kissakosmos disappeared when Roman fashion replaced ivy with gold wreaths which did not wilt. But for centuries, Greek bald men paid women to hide their heads. The Emeticon Hypodochos vomit receiver. At the Roman feast, the vomitorium is a myth. Romans did not have rooms for vomiting. But Greeks did. At long symposia, sometimes lasting 12 hours, diners ate to discomfort. To continue drinking, they induced vomiting, then returned to the table. The Emeticon Hypodochos vomit receiver held a bronze bowl while the diner vomited, then cleaned the bowl with vinegar and salt. This job is exactly as awful as it sounds. The receiver stood behind the diner's couch, bowl at waist height. When the diner gave a signal, usually a finger tap on the couch arm, the receiver knelt, placed the bowl under the diner's chin, and waited. After vomiting, the diner wiped his mouth on the receiver's sleeve, a cloth sewn onto the tunic for this purpose. The receiver then carried the bowl to a back room, cleaned it, and returned. The job required no disgust. Any sign of disgust, a wrinkled nose, a turned head, meant immediate flogging. Receivers learned to breathe through their mouths, to look at the ceiling while cleaning, and to sing softly to cover retching sounds. Some receivers developed a philosophical detachment. A slave named Sosiah said, "It is not vomit. It is wine that took a wrong turn." Despite the horror, the job paid more than any other household slave position, 8 obols per day plus a bonus for each event, 1 obol per vomit. A busy symposium might produce 20 events. A receiver could earn a month's wage in one night. The job vanished when Greek dining habits changed under Roman influence. By 100 BC, vomiting at dinner was considered barbaric ironic, given Roman excesses. The emeticon hyperdochos became a figure of comedy, then a memory. The Musocleptes song Stela. At a symposium, guests sang scholia drinking songs. But not everyone knew the lyrics. Enter the Musocleptes, literally song Stela, a slave who stood in the corner and whispered lyrics to guests who forgot them. This job required an extraordinary memory. The Musocleptes had to know hundreds of songs, including variations. Thebes had different verses than Athens. He also had to whisper without moving his lips. Lip movement was considered cheating. Guests signaled him by raising an eyebrow or touching an ear. He then leaned close and whispered the next line. If the Musocleptes whispered too loudly, other guests heard and accused the forgetful guest of incompetence. If he whispered too softly, the guest missed the line and stopped singing, a social disaster. The ideal whisper was a breath with meaning, audible only to the recipient. The job also involved correcting pitch. Many Greek men sang off-key. The Musocleptes could not correct directly. That would insult the guest. Instead, he hummed the correct pitch under his breath, hoping the guest would follow. This rarely worked. Most guests sang badly anyway. A famous Musocleptes named Semos served at the court of Archelaus of Macedon. He knew 847 songs by heart. When a guest asked for a song from Lesbos, Semos whispered, "My lord, that song has 17 verses, and you are drunk. Shall I give you the first 3? The guest agreed. Semos became known as the merciful whisperer. The job ended when writing became cheap and guests brought written lyrics on wax tablets. By 350 BCE, the Musocleptes was obsolete. But for a century, Greek symposia ran on whispers. The Apsaphagos Epitrapezios table salt taster. Salt was valuable in ancient Greece, so valuable that a special slave tasted it before each meal to ensure it was not adulterated, mixed with sand or gypsum. The Apsaphagos Epitrapezios table salt taster dipped his finger into the salt bowl, licked it, and declared it pure. But here is the ridiculous part. He had to taste salt from every bowl on the table. A large symposium might have 12 bowls of salt, one for each couch, plus extra for fish dishes. The salt taster went from bowl to bowl, dipping and licking, while guests watched. He could not skip a bowl. Any bowl not tasted might contain poison. The job was dangerous. Salt is a preservative. Tasting 12 bowls of salt in one meal could dehydrate the taster. Some salt tasters developed kidney stones. Others became permanently thirsty. A slave named Xanthias drank so much water after tasting that he vomited, and was beaten for vomiting near the table. But the job had one benefit. The salt taster was immune to poisoning attempts. Hosts who feared assassination often made their salt taster also taste wine and bread. The salt taster thus became a human poison detector, consuming tiny amounts of everything before the guests ate. If he survived the first course, the guests ate safely. If he collapsed, the guests left. This practice saved the life of the philosopher Aristotle. At a dinner in 347 BCE, his salt taster collapsed after tasting the wine. Aristotle fled. The host, a political enemy, was executed. Aristotle later wrote, "The tongue that tastes salt is the tongue that saves." The job ended when salt became cheap and adulteration rare. By 200 BCE, no household employed a dedicated salt taster. But for centuries, Greek diners ate only after watching a man lick salt 12 times. The commercial lunacies. The Amphoreus Grapsius Amphora inscriber. Every amphora of wine, oil, or fish sauce had to be inscribed with its origin, weight, and seller's name. But amphorae were wet clay when inscribed. The Grapsius inscriber worked at the potter's wheel, scratching letters into soft clay as the pot spun. This job required perfect handwriting and perfect timing. If the Grapsius scratched too early, the clay smeared. Too late, the clay hardened. He had to match the speed of the wheel, scratching one letter per rotation, left to right, while the potter spun the clay. A single mistake ruined the amphora. Most amphorae had only 3 words, the city name e.g., Thasos, the month, and a symbol for the producer. But some had long inscriptions, from the vineyard of Calais, son of Ariston, in the demi of Alapique, vintage year of the Archon Euclides, not mixed with water, suitable for drinking after 3 years. Imagine scratching that on a spinning pot. Grapses plural worked in teams of 3, one read the inscription from a wax tablet, one scratched, one checked for errors. The checker had to read the scratched letters while the pot still spun, a dizzying task. Many checkers became nauseated. Some vomited into the clay pit which caused the potter to beat them. The job paid by the amphora, 1 obol per 10 inscriptions. A fast Grapsius could do 200 amphorae per day, 20 obols, a good wage. But speed caused arthritis. Many Grapses ended their careers unable to hold a stylus. The job disappeared when stamped amphorae replaced inscribed 1 stamps pressed into clay before firing. By 300 BCE, the Grapsius existed only in small villages. But for 2 centuries, Greek wine traveled the Mediterranean with handwriting on wet clay. The Kairos Cycleptes wax seal closer. Every contract, letter, and legal document in ancient Greece was sealed with wax. A blob of hot wax was dripped onto the papyrus, then pressed with a signet ring. But someone had to heat the wax, drip it, and hand the ring to the signer. That someone was the Kairos Cycleptes wax seal closer. He worked in the agora, at a small table with a bronze brazier, a pot of beeswax, and a ladle. A client approached with a document. The Cycleptes heated the ladle in the brazier, scooped wax, dripped it onto the document, and handed the client his own signet ring. The client pressed the ring into the wax. The Cycleptes then reheated the ladle and dripped a second layer of wax over the ring, to protect the impression. The second layer was the ridiculous part. It added no security, anyone could melt it off. But tradition demanded it. The double layer symbolized truth twice sealed. Cycleptes who forgot the second layer were sued for invalidating contracts. The job required speed. Wax cools in seconds. The Cycleptes had to drip, hand the ring, receive the ring, and drip again before the first layer hardened. He also had to keep the wax at exactly the right temperature. Too hot, it ran off the papyrus. Too cool, it wouldn't drip. A famous Cycleptes named Nikon worked at the Piraeus port. He could seal 300 documents per hour, 1 every 12 seconds. His hands were covered in burn scars. When a customer asked why he didn't wear gloves, Nikon replied, "Gloves melt. Skin scars. I am my own gloves." The job ended when paper from Egypt replaced papyrus. Paper held wax poorly. By 200 BCE, most documents were sealed with thread instead of wax. The Cycleptes vanished, leaving behind only burned scars and sealed memories. The logographan hypergraphius speech writer's underwriter. Logographers speechwriters wrote speeches for illiterate litigants. But after writing the speech, someone had to read it aloud to the illiterate client until the client memorized it. That someone was the logographan hypergraphius, the underwriter who spoke the words so others could speak them. He sat in the logographer's office, facing the client, and read the speech at a slow pace. One clause, pause, client repeats. Clause, pause, repeat. A typical court speech lasted 30 minutes when delivered normally, but memorization took weeks. The hypergraphist read the same speech hundreds of times, in the same monotone, while the client stumbled through repetitions. The job required extraordinary patience. Clients forgot words. Clients invented new words. Clients wept, raged, or fell asleep. The hypergraphist could not react. Any reaction broke the client's concentration. He sat like a statue, speaking the same sentence for the 50th time. I come before you, gentlemen of the jury, not as an orator, but as a simple farmer. A hypergraphist named Diotimos once spent 3 months teaching a single speech to a client who had been kicked in the head by a mule. The client never learned it. Diotimos eventually delivered the speech himself, illegally, since hypergraphers were forbidden to speak in court. He was fined. The client lost the case. The job paid poorly 2 obols per day but offered a path to becoming a logographer. Many famous speechwriters started as hypergraphers, including Demosthenes, who had a stutter, ironic, given his job. Demosthenes later wrote, I learned rhythm from repeating others. Then I learned truth from breaking rhythm. The job ended when literacy spread in the Hellenistic period. By 250 BCE, most litigants could read their own speeches. The hypergraphist became a memory, the man who spoke so others could speak. The spondylokopos knucklebone counter. Knucklebones astragiloi were used as dice, coins, and gaming pieces. Merchants sold them by the hundred. But someone had to count them, and knucklebones are irregular, making counting by sight unreliable. The spondylokopos counted by touch. He ran his fingers over a pile of knucklebones, feeling each one, and announced the number. This job required fingertips so sensitive that the spondylokopos could distinguish 2 knucklebones that looked identical. He trained by counting grains of barley blindfolded. After a year of training, his fingertips had no fingerprints left, worn smooth by friction. The spondylokopos worked at gaming tables, at markets, and at temples. Knucklebones were used in divination. He counted before every transaction to prevent cheating. If he miscounted, the merchant or gambler lost money, and the spondylokopos lost his job. A famous spondylokopos named Pythagoras, not the philosopher, could count 1,000 knucklebones in 3 minutes with 99% accuracy. He worked at the Olympia festival, counting bones for the gambling booths. One year, a cheater replaced 30 knucklebones with carved stones. Pythagoras felt the difference instantly. Stones were colder. The cheater was beaten. The job ended when standardized dice cubic, easy to count, replaced knucklebones around 200 BCE. The last spondylokopos recorded is a woman named Melita in Alexandria, who counted knucklebones for the temple of Serapis. When asked why she worked such a strange job, she replied, "Fingers remember what eyes forget." The micro-stathmopoios small weight maker. Greek merchants used lead weights of specific sizes, 1 mina 431 grams, half mina, quarter mina, etc. But lead is soft, weights wore down over time. Someone had to recast worn weights into exact sizes. That someone was the micro-stathmopoios, small weight maker. He worked with a miniature scale, a set of bronze master weights, and a lead melting furnace. A merchant brought a worn weight. The stathmopoios melted it, poured the lead into a mold, then filed the cooled weight until it matched the master weight exactly. The filing was the key. He filed a tiny bit, weighed, filed again, weighed again, sometimes 50 times per weight. The job required microscopic precision. A weight off by even 2 grams could ruin a merchant's reputation selling short or bankrupt him giving too much. Stathmopoioi were licensed by the city and tested annually. A stathmopoios who made inaccurate weights was crucified, literally. In 387 BC, A stathmopoios in Corinth was nailed to a post for selling underweight 1 mina weights to olive oil merchants. Despite the risk, stathmopoioi were respected. They were the only craftsmen who could not cheat. Their work was constantly checked. A stathmopoios named Euthynos became famous for his honesty. When a merchant offered him a bribe to make overweight weights so the merchant could sell short, Euthynos reported him to the magistrate. The merchant was exiled. Euthynos was given a gold crown. The job ended when standardized coinage replaced weighed bullion. By 250 BCE, most transactions used coins, not weighed metal. The stathmopoios became a coin maker instead, a less precise, more profitable job. The religious eccentricities. The hieroskopos entrail reader's assistant. In Greek sacrifice, a hieroskopos priestly diviner read animal entrails to predict the future. But he could not touch the entrails himself. Touching raw organs was considered polluting for priests. So his assistant, the hieroskopos hyporgos, no official name, but we will call him the entrails holder, held the liver, lungs, and heart while the priest examined them. The assistant held each organ on a bronze tray, tilted toward the priest. He could not speak, speaking would distract the priest. He could not sneeze, sneezing would spray organ juice onto the priest. He could not drop anything, dropping an organ invalidated the sacrifice. This job required standing completely still for hours, holding slippery organs, while the priest muttered and pointed. The assistant's arms ached. The organs dripped blood onto his feet. Flies gathered. He could not shoo them, shooing would move the tray. A famous assistant named Agathon served at the Delphic oracle for 40 years. He held organs for kings, generals, and philosophers. When asked how he endured, he said, "I think of nothing. I am a table. Tables do not complain." The job had one perk. After the priest finished reading, the assistant could eat the organs. Sacrificed animals were cooked and eaten, but the organs were considered too polluted for priests or worshippers. Assistants got them. Agathon ate so many livers that he developed gout. He died at 60, full of gods and offal. The job ended when Roman priests decided that touching entrails was not polluting. By 100 BCE, the hieroskopos held his own organs. The assistant became obsolete and underfed. The libation sponge carrier. Libations, wine offerings to the gods, were poured onto altars, onto the ground, or onto sacred stones. But spilled wine attracted ants and bees. Someone had to clean it up before the insects arrived. Insects on an altar were a bad omen. That someone was the libation sponge carrier. He followed the priest during rituals, carrying a bucket of water and a sponge on a stick. After each libation, he sponged the spilled wine. He could not sponge too quickly, that would show disrespect to the gods. The wine needed time to soak into the altar. He could not sponge too slowly, ants would arrive. The ideal timing: wait 30 heartbeats, then sponge. The job also involved cleaning the priest's hands. Priests' hands became sticky with wine and honey. The sponge carrier wiped them between libations, using a fresh sponge for each wipe. A single sponge was used once, then thrown away, to avoid mixing the wine of different gods. Apollo's wine could not touch Zeus's sponge. This created enormous waste. A major festival like the Panathenea required 2,000 sponges. Athens imported sponges from the island of Kalymnos, which had a sponge diving industry. The libation sponge carrier was thus part of a supply chain that employed hundreds of divers. A sponge carrier named Sotion once used a dirty sponge on the hands of a priest of Dionysus. The priest developed a rash, which he interpreted as divine displeasure. Sotion was banished from Athens for sponge negligence. He moved to Corinth, where he became a fishmonger. The job ended when rituals simplified under Roman rule. By 150 BC, libations were poured directly into a bowl, then emptied later, no sponging needed. The sponge carrier vanished, but Kalymnian sponge divers continued for centuries. The Kurnos carrier sacrifice bowl carrier. The Kurnos was a ritual bowl with multiple small cups attached. Each cup held a different offering: wheat, barley, honey, oil, wine, milk, and water. During a sacrifice, someone had to carry the Kurnos around the altar 7 times, holding it level so the offerings did not spill. That someone was the Kurnos carrier. This job required perfect balance. The Kurnos had no handles. The carrier held it with both hands underneath, like a waiter carrying a large tray. He walked at a slow, ritual pace, 1 step per heartbeat, around the altar. Each circuit took 3 minutes. 7 circuits equals 21 minutes of holding a heavy, unbalanced bowl. If the carrier spilled any offering, the sacrifice had to restart. This happened often. At the Eleusinian Mysteries in 450 BC, a Kurnos carrier tripped over a stone and spilled the honey. The priest declared the omen bad. The festival was delayed for 3 days while they found a new carrier. Carriers were chosen from the healthiest young men in the village. No old men, no women, no slaves. They trained for weeks by carrying bowls of water around their own houses. A carrier named Cleitos could walk 7 circuits while reciting poetry. He once carried the Kurnos at the temple of Demeter at Eleusis without spilling a single drop. The priest gave him a roasted piglet as a reward. The job ended when the Kurnos itself became obsolete, replaced by separate offering bowls. By 300 BCE, the Kurnos carrier existed only in rural festivals. But in those villages, he was the most admired man of the year, for walking in circles without dropping things. The Omphalos oil dripper. The Omphalos navel stone at Delphi was a sacred stone covered in oil. The oil kept the stone from cracking. Someone had to drip fresh olive oil onto the stone every hour, day and night. That someone was the Omphalos oil dripper. He worked in shifts, 4 drippers per day, each working 6 hours. He carried a bronze oil can with a long spout. He walked to the Omphalos, dripped exactly 7 drops onto the top, then walked away. 7 drops, no more, no less. 6 drops, the stone dried. 8 drops, the oil ran down the sides and stained the floor. The job was mind-numbing. The dripper stood in the temple, alone, with nothing to do but wait for the hour to pass. He could not read, oil would stain papyrus. He could not talk, no one else was there. He could not sleep, sleeping on duty was punishable by flogging. He simply waited, watching the shadow on the floor, and when the shadow moved 1 finger width, he dripped. A dripper named Timon the Silent worked at Delphi for 30 years. He never spoke a word to anyone. When the priest asked why, Timon wrote on a wax tablet, "I have forgotten how. The oil is my voice." After his death, the temple erected a statue of him, a man with an oil can, forever dripping. The job ended when the Roman general Sulla looted Delphi in 86 BCE. He took the Omphalos to Rome, where it was broken and discarded. The oil dripper had no stone to drip on. The job vanished in a single day. The Hosioi ear cleaner. The Hosioi were a group of 5 sacred men at Delphi who served the oracle for life. They had to remain pure, which meant no bodily impurities. Earwax was considered an impurity. So the Hosioi ear cleaner cleaned the ears of all 5 Hosioi every morning. He used a bronze scoop, a linen cloth, and a bowl of warm water. He cleaned each ear carefully, removing all visible wax, then wiped the outer ear with the cloth. The Hosioi could not clean their own ears. Self-cleaning was considered self-pollution. Touching one's own impurities spread them. The ear cleaner was not allowed to speak to the Hosioi while cleaning. Speech disturbed their morning meditation. He worked in silence, moving from ear to ear, while the Hosioi stared at the wall. If he hurt an ear, a scratch, a nick, the Hosioi had to be repurified with a full day of fasting. A famous ear cleaner named Hermias worked for 30 years without a single scratch. His secret: he heated the bronze scoop in the warm water before inserting it. Warm metal is softer than cold metal. He also used a drop of olive oil as lubricant. The hosioi praised him as the gentle one. After the oracle closed in 390 CE by Christian decree, the ear cleaner had no work. Hermes was last seen begging at the gates of Delphi, holding his bronze scoop. No one knew what it was. The deathly absurdities. The prothesis wailer professional mourner. Greek funerals had a prothesis laying out of the body. The family hired professional wailers, women who screamed, tore their hair, and beat their breasts. But someone had to lead the wailing, setting the rhythm and volume. That someone was the prothesis wailer leader, or exarchos threnu. She stood at the head of the body and began the wail, a high-pitched cry, then a low moan, then a chant of the dead person's name. The other wailers followed. The leader controlled the tempo, fast wailing for tragedy, slow for dignity. She also decided when to stop. Funerals could last 12 hours. The leader's throat gave out after 6. Wailers trained from childhood. They practiced screaming without damaging their voices, using a technique called ventriloquist wailing, screaming from the stomach, not the throat. A good wailer could be heard across a cemetery. A bad wailer lost her voice in an hour. The job paid by the hour, 4 obols per hour for the leader, 2 for followers. A wealthy funeral might employ 20 wailers for 2 days, a huge expense. Some families tried to save money by wailing themselves, but amateur wailing was considered disrespectful. The dead needed professionals. A famous wailer named Myrto led the funeral of Pericles 429 BCE. She wailed for 18 hours straight, setting a record. Afterward, she could not speak for a month. Pericles' family gave her a silver mirror as thanks. The job ended when Solon's laws restricted funeral expenses 6th century BCE. Wailing was banned except for close relatives. Professional wailers became unemployed overnight. Many became prostitutes, the only other job for loud women. The taphos Coptes grave digger's assistant. Grave digging in rocky Greek soil required 2 men, one dug, one carried rocks away. But the assistant taphos Coptes had an additional duty. After the burial, he had to jump into the grave and stamp down the soil with his feet. Why stamp? To prevent animals from digging up the body. Loose soil attracts foxes and dogs. Compacted soil deters them. The taphos Coptes jumped up and down on the fresh grave until his footprints disappeared, meaning the soil was packed hard enough. This job was terrifying. The grave was 6 feet deep, narrow 2 feet wide, and dark. The assistant jumped alone, with the body at his feet. Sometimes the body shifted. Gases escaping made the corpse groan. Assistants often fainted. A few died of heart attacks. A taphos Coptes named Philon fainted in a grave and was buried alive. His fellow diggers did not notice, they thought he had left. 3 hours later, Philon woke up screaming. He was rescued, but he lost his mind. He spent the rest of his life digging graves, then jumping in, then screaming. The job paid 5 obols per grave, excellent money. But turnover was high. Most taphos Copti lasted less than a year before quitting or dying. The longest serving on record is a man named Doros, who worked for 20 years. He was missing 3 fingers bitten off by a fox that dug into a grave he was stamping. Doros continued working. The job ended when Greeks began using stone grave markers that covered the entire grave. By 200 BCE, no one needed to stamp soil, the stone did the work. The lekithos oil filler. At Greek graves, mourners left lekithoi small oil flasks filled with olive oil as offerings. But the oil evaporated quickly in the sun. Someone had to refill the flasks every morning. That someone was the lekithos oil filler, a cemetery worker employed by wealthy families. He walked through the cemetery at dawn, carrying a clay jug of oil. He checked each family's grave markers, found the lekithoi, and refilled them to the brim. He also cleaned the flasks' mouths, dust clogged the pore, and replaced any broken flasks. The job was sacred but tedious. A large cemetery like the Karamakos had thousands of lekithoi. The filler could only refill about 200 per morning, so wealthy families paid extra for priority. A filler named Callias had a route. He refilled the graves of the Alcmeonidae. First they paid triple, then the tombs of the generals, then everyone else. If a family stopped paying, the filler left their lekithoi empty. Empty offerings were a sign that the dead had been forgotten, a social disgrace. Some families paid the filler for years after moving away from Athens, just to keep the oil flowing. The job ended when lekithoi went out of fashion, replaced by stone reliefs. By 300 BCE, the oil filler was a memory. But for a century, Athenian graves stayed oily because of a man with a jug. The Mnesta Patella kneecap collector. In some Greek regions, notably Thessaly, mourners broke the kneecaps of the dead before burial. Why? They believed that the ghost could not walk without kneecaps. Thus, the ghost could not haunt the living. Someone had to perform the breaking. That someone was the Mnesta Patella kneecap collector. He used a bronze hammer and a wooden block. After the body was washed and dressed, he placed the block under the knee, raised the hammer, and struck, once on each knee. The sound was a sharp crack. Then he collected the broken kneecap pieces and placed them in a small clay box, which was buried with the body. The job required strength and indifference. Knees are hard to break. The hammer needed force. Many kneecap collectors developed shoulder injuries. Others developed psychological damage. A collector named Lycos began hearing cracking sounds in his sleep. He eventually killed himself with his own hammer. Despite the horror, the job was respected in Thessaly. Collectors were seen as protectors of the living. They walked in funerals with their heads high, hammers polished. A collector's hammer was passed down through generations, like a family sword. The practice ended when Christianity reached Thessaly 4th century CE. The church declared kneecap breaking a mutilation of God's image. The last collector, a man named Alexandros, buried his hammer in a field and became a shepherd. The Energismatus fire tender. At annual ancestor festivals Energismata, families lit fires on graves to feed the dead. The dead consumed the smoke. Someone had to tend these fires all night, adding wood, stirring ashes, ensuring the fire never went out. That someone was the Energismatus fire tender, usually a slave owned by the family. He sat by the grave from sunset to sunrise, feeding the fire with olive branches sacred to the dead. He could not sleep. If the fire died, the dead would go hungry, and the family would have bad luck for a year. He could not leave, the fire might spread. He simply sat, alone in the cemetery, watching flames. The job was dangerous. Drunks passed through cemeteries at night. Animals attacked. Once, a fire tender in Athens was killed by a wild boar that charged the fire. The family held another Energismatus to appease the dead slave's ghost, then hired a new tender. A famous fire tender named Dido, a Phoenician slave in Corinth, tended the same grave for 40 years, the grave of her former master, who had freed her in his will. She built a small hut next to the grave and lived there. When she died, the family buried her next to the grave. The fire went out that night. No one relit it. The job ended when ancestor festivals declined in the Hellenistic period. By 150 BCE, few families observed Energismata. Fire tenders became homeless wanderers, carrying their fire in pots, looking for graves to tend. We have walked through 35 ridiculous jobs. Each one, no matter how strange, was once a living person's daily reality. The coprologos woke up and smelled dung. The trapezomisthos ate greasy bread. The omphalos oil dripper watched shadows move. These were not jokes to them. They were rent, food, survival. But why did these jobs disappear? Not because Greeks became less ridiculous. Because technology changed. Urine became unnecessary when fullers found clay. Wax seals became unnecessary when paper arrived. Entrails became unnecessary when Romans conquered. The ridiculous job is always a symptom of a missing invention. We laugh because we have washing machines, napkins, and toilets. They did not. Consider what jobs we have today that will seem ridiculous in 2000 years. Social media content moderator? Algorithmic bias auditor? Drone recharger? These are our coprolagar. Future people will laugh. We them yet. In the Karamakos cemetery, archaeologists found a simple stone with an inscription. It reads, "Here lies Dromius, son of Dromius, coprolagos of the sacred gate. He collected what others left. He gave what others burned. His fire lasted 200 nights. Perhaps a son, carved that epitaph. They did not write it as a joke. They wrote it as respect. Dromius kept the bathhouses warm. He kept the lamps lit. He did a ridiculous job and he did it well." That is the final truth of ancient Greece's most ridiculous jobs. They were ridiculous to us, but to them, they were just Tuesday.